let's come to the presentation for today. This week is the 46th week out of 52 in this year. The series, the Parayana. Para means above or beyond. Yana is the ancient Sanskrit for way. This is the way across. This is the way beyond. It's classical. It goes back about 2,500 years, but constantly now is freshened so that it is quite recent. In fact, not now, but presenced continuously. All over the planet, there are individuals, persons, working, learning by themselves or in groups, usually small groups, sometimes isolated, sometimes networking with other isolated individuals or groups and coursing their way into a completely new time form. And we've been looking at most of this year the way in which time forms in nature are the first dimension of time. And that time as a dimension spontaneously emerges from a zero field of Mother Nature. She's fertile. She doesn't need this, that, or the other. And out of her fertile zero, a first dimension of time occurs. And because it is time, its energy, its dynamic instantly then blossoms space, birth space. So that you have a feminine continuum that comes out of a mysterious sourcing and continues to emerge, to birth, to give not just a proliferation, but a timeline. And this natural timeline, because it has such a huge population of dimensions in space, 3, the best way to describe it about 100 years ago was to talk about the fabric of space-time. And that space-time, as Einstein began in his patent office in Bern, Switzerland, to muse upon, not looking at all these complex patents and arguments and details, he came to understand that space-time is curved. And that it is curved because there is a gravity that brings together phenomenality. And that the more the phenomenality is large and heavy, the more it sinks into the fabric of space-time and space-time curves. This curving of space-time, when it comes through billions of years of the universe developing and proliferating, birthing, emerging, when it came to this particular planet in this particular star system, about 6,350 years ago, 4,300 BC, what had been being prepared from a very interesting fabric of cultures, their interpenetration, their roots deeply in Africa, their long career of burgeoning and differentiating and coming into a huge complexity of various qualities of very sentient beings. emerged eventually in the original bridging over point from Africa to the Near East. And in a double prong, not only crossing over a narrow isthmus of the Red Sea into southern Arabia, but also going along that southern coast of Arabia into the Persian Gulf. And eventually there was a confluence that cultures began to mix together at the confluence of that inland from the Persian Gulf, inland from the Red Sea, inland from the Mediterranean Sea, that all of a sudden the sophistication of many different overlays of complex intercultural traditions and customs, the speaking quality had refined itself to becoming able to be put into signs for images, and signs eventually for phonics, for a pronunciation, for a sound of what one was saying, and able to make a sign, a picture, an image, so that the images became the things and the signs for how you were saying something became verbs. And one eventually had, about 4350 BC, what we have come to call a reference wave, that there was a written language that for the first time was complex enough. It not only had images and tonal sounds imaged, but had come together in words that had the vocabulary and grammar and syntax enough to have a written language. And that happened at that confluence in that ancient melting pot. And what was developed there was the first way in which the preparation of men and women growing up from boys and girls, that a few of them had learned to write, which meant that they had learned to read. And by having about 3.5 centuries of the experience of being raised continuously by mothers and fathers that would pass on this literate quality, by about 4000 BC, that reference wave became a carrier wave. It became the major quality by which the culture had transformed into a civilization. That it was available for all of the disparate groups and all of the disparate persons to be able to communicate with each other in writing. And that gave birth, about 4000 BC, to a new quality of men and women, and of course, in keeping with the way in which fertile zero-field Mother Nature began it all, the very first quality of visioning through a written language, to be able to look that nature was interesting, but was not all, there's something beyond. The myth of that, the first woman was Eve. And so the quality of wisdom, of a vision, not dispensing with nature, but looking at nature in a complexity enough to gain the intensity of being able to see beyond a fifth dimension. That space and time were certainly phenomenally and actively there, but there was something beyond, something more, something higher, if you like. And nature, in her zero field sourcing mystery, welcomed that wisdom. It was like a daughter for her. And so two other dimensions came into play almost immediately that had been developing for several thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. The visionary dimension and the ability to express that visionary dimension in art. And so the quality of a written language became an art that took a while for it to sophisticate itself. And meanwhile, it was apparent to Eve that proverbially, we do not have to remain naked. We can put on some finery, some clothes. One of the trees in that natural mythological setting of Eden was the date palm. And that date palm in the wild produced a few dates from time to time in its blossoming and fruiting season. But when the discovery through written and read communication, it was discovered that we have been taming animals and plants and minerals and even now metals and even ourselves in a quintessential way, that date palm, when cultivated, along with several of the other crops that had been learned to cultivate, and largely women doing the cultivating, the selecting, the experience of it, it was found that the cultivated date palm increased its bearing of fruit. Where there were a handful or sometimes dozens of dates, there were now hundreds, if not thousands, of dates available. And so the date palm became about 4000 BC for an Eve, mythically but actual, that now there is a tree that has given us a key to a better life, to a different quality of life. And that ancient symbol of the date palm became a quality that was eventually given a mythological character of a divine woman in heaven who guaranteed that life can mature into love, and on earth the ability to defend that love and defend that life from the impairments that would come. One of the qualities of ancient discovery in those date palm gardens was that the juice of dates from the date palm is a natural anti-corrosive for metals, and also has a sustaining quality in biologics. And so the date palm, with its mythological figure, her early name in Sumerian was Inanna. Inanna. And it was from 4350 BC to 2350 BC, 2,000 years, that the written language of the first reference wave became the first world literature in the second. That second, in fact, was a third reference wave. Because in between 4350 and 2350, that pivot was 3350 BC. And that pivot is a masculine take on this new sense of power that comes by utilizing this dynamic and its fruits, by not only utilizing it, by ordering it, putting it into structure, putting it into form. And it wasn't enough for that 3350 BC to have all of these developments of nature into vision and even into art. Now, the masculine reference wave of 3350 decided that, look at all of these prosperous cities, why not bring these cities together in a larger, more powerful pattern? And so the first empires were made. And they had a masculine tone to them. This structure takes advantage of all of the developments and gifts that we have developed, been given, but the gifting was forgotten, and it was just assumed that this is all just preparation for our importance, our power. And so a masculine imperium of extensive linking together many cities or many areas surrounding those cities, so that by 3000 BC you had literally the first dynastic empires in the world. You had them in Egypt. You had a very powerful Samaria. You had them beginning in China and in India. And even in the far west, one finds a quality of that kind of extension by about 3200 BC, where a huge tumulus was made in the Boyne River Valley in Ireland, and that heaped dome structure had a tunnel within it that led to the center of its structure and was arranged because of several thousand years of distilling information and correlation with the heavens and the earth. A masculine construction was made called now Newgrange. And on the winter solstice, at sunrise, for the first time, the sun would go through this portal in that sod stone dome and shine all the way down the tunnel, increasing as the sun would rise and come up, and light at the very back of that tunnel, carved as an esoteric glyph, a triple spiral in the stone. And that triple spiral was the understanding that this is a triple level, a thrice greatest, a second transform, that we have been able to tame now the earth in terms of plants and animals and ourselves, and now we're able to extend our taming to be able to understand. We're now seeing and understanding and controlling here the structure of the celestial, the rising of the sun and the setting of it, its annual cycle, the rising of the moons and its cycle. And so one had this sense of a masculine extension of an earthly network that now had all of the correlates to a celestial, universal, beyond the world correlation. And so the empires of 3000 BC, like in Egypt, all of the various areas called nomes, which had constituted themselves into a pair, a polarity, the north and the south in Egypt, clustered around the spinal cord of the Nile River, now became 3000 BC, united together. And the crown of the Southern Nome Federation, the crown of the Northern Nome Federation were put together, birthday cake wise, and you had the first pharaoh. In Sumeria, you had very powerful kings now that styled themselves the kings over this network. The ancient Sumerian word for that was Lugal, the king of all. And in China, you had the beginnings of the quality that now we have an understanding of the way in which a polarized interchange that can be expressed in writing of a line that is dynamic and a broken line, which is the constellation at the invisible focus of that dynamic, which is the space. And that by weaving together the space and the time in a polarized way and arranging those so that there was a third element that was a distributed repeat of the one and then the other, that you had the trigrams that in their sequence of the broken line at the bottom of the three, at the middle, at the top, and then a fourth where they were all unbroken. And the line which is unbroken, it's pure time dynamic, a polarity to the broken line of space, of the fertility of space, of the feminine of space. This is the masculine of creative structuring. And so the creative and the receptive, the unbroken at the bottom of one trigram, at the middle and at the top, and then the three together, making a set of 8. So that the cubing of 2, making 8, by 3000 BC in China was already an intelligence of a structure which is celestial and yet applied on the earth, applied especially to gender, to the formalized structuring of the way in which gender in humanity would be controlled by a structuring overall. And this, of course, for civilization, has been one of the bruised soft spots that has become a sore, and that now, for some long while, has become a wound. In the 21st century, there are groups like the group in the western Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts. It published a little volume. Their founders sent me, courtesy of a mutual friend, Corking the Nuclear Genie, the Promise of Low Energy Transmutation. That there is the promise now that one can deal with very sophisticated, what used to be nuclear fission as in the atomic bomb, as in controlled fission, as in reactors that breed not only energy but make radioactive waste, that even more powerful, millions of times more powerful than the fission reactions, which can change materials, elements from one to another, is cool fusion, because fusion power is much more sophisticated. And in cool fusion, again by the same group, 3 or 4 older guys, their wife, and several others. The telling chapter is chapter 10, Quantum Tunneling and the Quantum Rabbit Effect. Their company is called Quantum Rabbit. And it is this cool fusion that is able to take place in very small vials in personal laboratories with a bit, just a thumbnail bit of material and a plasma environment and a charge of energized electrons, and one can have a fusion where something transmutes into something else. And this is especially germane because in the very latest issue of Nature, the international magazine of science, this is Nature for 6th of November, 2014. The cover story is Full Speed Ahead, Plasma Wakefield Machines, and its central argument is about a new accomplishment in Palo Alto Menlo Park, just on the verge of Stanford University, jutting out from the very northern edge of Stanford is a long tunnel that's 2 kilometers long, aiming into the hills, into the low mountain range, at the top of which is Skyline Boulevard that goes all the way to San Francisco and all the way down to towards Santa Cruz. One of my good friends lives at the crest on Skyline Boulevard, where Stanford Linear Accelerator points. The headline, Surfs Up at SLAC. And the illustration shows a remarkable transformation that has happened. They have now found a way to do a cool fusion that packs the energy of a cyclotron or a linear accelerator into something which is the size of a portable PC. Instead of 2 kilometers, it can be done in 30 centimeters, 1/3 of a meter. It's about a foot. We are rapidly emerging freshly into a completely new time form. As the metronome of the way in which civilization gets its carrier waves. And yes, referring back to the reference waves. The sophistication of the ability to express in written language, in read language, has reached in the dawn now of the digital age, the age of computers and lasers and a whole panoply, that in a couple of years, by 2016, will be indelibly convincing that this is a new world. Not only a new world, but plural, new worlds. And that what we're looking at here in the Parayana series is the way in which one can begin to understand science and art and how their sourcing is in a consciousness which is there. Art's consciousness sources in vision. Science's consciousness sources in history. And so it's the understanding of vision. The ancient Greek word best used for visioning is a theoria, out of which we get the modern science term theory. From theory to the science, the application, the understanding, the ability to write it out, to do the equations, to do, in fact, a double transform of the equations, not just a math with all of its proliferation and sophistication. But since the end of the 1940s, beginning of the 1950s, due to somebody local here, Richard Feynman at Caltech in Pasadena, when he was helping refine quantum electrodynamics to be able to be expressed, he found that what was holding everyone back was that it took such a sophistication of mathematics, it took so long to be able to learn to that level of sophistication, and how it had mystification built into it, because more and more, like in the quantum realm, there were conundrums. So Feynman developed his diagrams, his famous diagrams, that are the expression of the way in which a path integral has a differential conscious application and development. And those squiggles in Feynman diagrams are remarkably like the squiggles that we see when we look at the subatomic way in which molecules of proteins are made, and the way in which elements like protons, as the real center of the nucleus. Somebody once gave a simile that if the atom is a football field, the nucleus is a football on the center 50-yard line. The proton is an eyelet of the lace of that football. And its structure shows similar squiggles, which are now called gluons. And the gluons bring together and glue quarks, especially in pairs. They don't like to be by themselves. They like being paired. They like having a quality of symmetry. And it's quite interesting because when one brings a third quark into play, the resulting integral is actually a double transform. One of the way in which the gluons bring the quarks together, and the third quark makes it a permanent transform integral that's related both to particality and to waves. Those three quarks together make something as stable as the proton and the neutron, which once they're created in the universe, will last longer than the universe has lasted. It's a new definition of permanence. The quality that we're looking at now is the way in which there have been a few special persons in recent living history. And we're looking today at two women especially. One in terms of archaeology, sociology, anthropology, and mysticism. And the other looking at history and religion and developments and mystical experience as well. And the first one we're looking at, she was born in 1921 and is still alive. She's going to be 93. Her name is Edith Turner. She just wrote a memoir of a return to Africa called The Spirit and the Drum, a memoir of Africa, because she was married to a gnome-like genius named Victor Turner. He was born in 1920, the year before her, but he died in 1983 of a health condition. They came together doing anthropological investigation and going to Zambia in Africa, Central Africa. And central to Zambia for them was a tribe known as the Ndembu. And by living for many years with the Ndembu and finding that their special qualities of not really getting along with the structure of the way in which cultures and the civilization had tried to condition them, they found a spiritual freedom among the Ndembu. So powerful that in 1989, about 86, just a few years after Victor died, in the Tulane Drama Review, Tulane University in New Orleans, Edith Turner published a revisiting of the Ndembu and a bringing out of the photographs that she had taken, the remembrances that she had had living with the Ndembu, and the whole article in a world-class drama journal. Playwrights. Philip Kabwita, Ghost Doctor. And it's about the way in which a young woman among the Ndembu gets pregnant, goes through the pregnancy and all of the rituals, all of the different complications and sustenances, and gives birth to a baby girl, and how the midwife and the mother and the daughter, the infant, and the whole people, not just a tribe, but the people, including the Turners and their 3 children who were living with them, with the Ndembu, of how it was that they were able to understand reality for the first time in a complete, larger sense, that not only the 4 dimensions of space-time, but a further 4 dimensions of consciousness in an ecology, that they understood that reality is recognizable. It's not discovered as something weird, odd. It is very special in a paradoxical way in that it is really natural. It is really conscious. And there's no polarity involved whatsoever. That the fertility of genders coming together is not about polarities being distributed however complexly. It's about love giving birth and the resonance of it being a harmonic of reality. Let's take a little break. Let's come back. We're looking at, as we closed, Edith Turner. She and her husband, Victor, went to live in Zambia with the Ndembu. In 2006, she published Heart of Lightness, this life story of an anthropologist. And she reminisced in here and had written eulogy for their African sojourn when she and her husband then, who was still alive, returned to England. And she recalled in the book that we've been looking at by her, The Spirit and the Drum, memoir of... This was her concluding short paragraph. When Vic and I were reestablished in England, we were heartsick for Africa. Never mind the handy gas range, the flush toilets of civilization. We had lost our own family. All that we could do now was work. Then a year later, and the children back at school after a bout of chickenpox, there came a night of certainty and meaning. It so happened that when I went to bed unreasonably mournful at the end of a long period of effort, my sleep settled and settled until all of the strain of the useless material were drained away. Suddenly, the valves of my mind were opened, and I had a dream. I was back in Kojima. My heart turned over. It dissolved like of the overgrown track and the plaza that opened out as I moved toward people there. Did not look at me. Everything was taken for granted. Nyamuwela was there, passing on one side. Mangalishi, too. She fell behind as I walked on. To greet someone, no hand touched mine, but everyone was present. Their faces relaxed. I was actually back, spread until my range of sight opened out to the entire. I seemed to widen and glide into the whole of it. From touch and tread, I was home. This quality, the quality of presence that is shared in our new carrier wave time form, that shared presence, the time energy wave. She and Victor did field work in several other locations. The Ndembu were constantly the source of realization, the source of recognition, the fruiting of vision into the art of anthropology, into the humanity of reality. One of her other publication entries so far, which just came out in 2012, is entitled Communitas, the Anthropology of Collective Joy. It is about many quality community, this kind of a community, like her biography that has a beautiful presentation in famous film, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Wrote this beautiful as a novel, and is evident in still writing at 93. Community, a description, quote, field work, but with a tribe very close to the Nome area coast of the tribe, the word for themselves as Inuit, of how town faced the possibility of starvation. The waters had warmed and the wind had opened up that Arctic Ocean corridor, estuary, the Bering Strait, Aleutians, quite far. Ice, so that there was open water to go hunting for the sustenance of the people, which was whale hunting. They were allowed by American Canadian, because American Canadians have to work together with the Inuit. They were allowed 3 whales per season to make their meat, as the American Indian phrase is. But they hadn't made meat. They hadn't hunted whale. For such a long time, their supplies were running out. And though the sea was open, it was open because a prevailing south wind would not give up and blew the remaining ice abutting shore far enough that the boats could not get out to the open water. And so the community came together at the community church, ostensibly a Christian church, but in the Inuit way of presencing, in what she calls aptly communitas, the shared presence community. And she was there. She participated. And all of the travail, the specter of starvation throughout, melted into a kind of a communitas, as she calls it. They were the ones who developed that name way back in the 50s, 60s. Paul Goodman and his wife, brother Percival did a book called Communitas in New York, but the origin comes from the Turners. The Inuit in that community, in that church, with Edith present and remembering in 2012 how the entire ethos of the interior of that structure changed, how it became a kind of a plasma of energy shared among all of the people, the men and the women, the boys and the girls, the infants. And that this tremendous glow of shared presence began to come in, and the refrain over and over again was a prayer, was a hymn to the north wind to come and blow the ice away from the shore so the boats could go out, so they could make their meat, hunt their whales. And she said for a long while, they continued in that glow, in that communitas. And late in the evening, when they finished their prayer, their hymn, their visioning, and they were coming out into the Alaskan open vastness, the north wind was blowing steadily. And in a little while, the boats were able to make their way out. And she said, it is this quality that she recognized was there for them first in Africa, among the Ndembo, that they had learned that all human populations, having been gifted by the fullness of the natural cycle had come to understand through their ritual comportment that generated the experiences of their mythic horizon of language, of images, of feeling. That those then sourced and gave the filaments for a natural integral in their symbols. Not a structure of a plan, but an integral of the way in which the entire cycle reached its crowning. And it is this quality of shared presence that led especially her husband, Victor Turner, whose mother raised him. The father was an engineer from Glasgow, Scotland, a Scottish engineer, exactly how it sounds. But the mother was a career actress, and she is the one that founded the Scottish National Theatre. And she raised Victor to understand that the performance is the foundation of the way in which the experience is going to give the filaments that are weavable. And these will be woven in that loom of the harmonics of the symbols, of the motions of the actors, of the interchange of the drama, of the theater that includes the audience as a participant in the presencing of this magic. One of his great little books is From Ritual to Theater, The Seriousness of Human Play. One of his classics is called The Ritual Process. But two of his books are extremely important as a pair. One is The Anthropology of Performance. The other is The Anthropology of Experience. The ritual performance naturally courses into the experience. And the foreword or epilogue is by Clifford Geertz, Geertz. Clifford Geertz and Victor Turner are the founders, the generators of symbolic anthropology late in the 20th century. Here, Geertz, who did his field work in Indonesia, he learned to be real. He learned to recognize humanity and participate in it continuously in Indonesia. In 1971, he published a little recompense on all kinds of critics of symbolic anthropology, Myth, Symbol, and Culture, and famous for many, many books on, like Victor Turner is, on the way in which an anthropology, like a sociology, like a psychology, that all of these disparate, disciplined sciences leach out the continuity, leach out the way in which there is, as we talked about last week, Buckminster Fuller called it a tensegrity, a distribution of tension throughout the entire structure, so that the structure is not load-bearing, but that the structure is presencing. The equilibrium is the equation of the state of the real. To paraphrase a mathematical term, the equation of state is one of the great discoveries coming out of cosmology and nuclear physics couple of generations ago. This quality comes through now in the 21st century, early on. We're only one generation into the new time form. One of the wonderful figures of real wizard is a longtime friend of mine, some 30 years or so, John Maluski. This is a reprint from the net, The Wonderful World of Advanced Materials, making things by assembling one atom at a time. And now we're having cool fusion of being able to reassemble atoms into its constituent elements and being able to not only divide but to multiply, to come up with an impossible solution that something which is a radioactive waste out of nuclear plants, the most devastating of them is cesium, radioactive cesium, 130. It is the quality of being able to put this through a cool fusion raised to the industrial scale of permanently taking by transmutation the radioactive element waste and putting it into two elements that are not radioactive at all, that in fact are quite natural and fit in with the ecology of life and its fullness, its naturalness. One of the demonstrations of science that one of our ladies looked at, her daughter was teaching science in a New Jersey high school and came upon an experiment that would show the class on that level of New Jersey high schoolness how something which is taken as made can be fractionated into its constituent parts. She took a little vial and put baking soda in it and then heated it and had this fractionating so that the sodium as an element would separate from the H2O, the water, in such a way that you had a completely different quality of demonstration, that one can do immense enormity with very compact actuality. And this quality surfaces in our species, in any species, with recognizing that there is a difference between education and learning. An education is progressing by definite steps, given the limitations, given the structure, given the way in which it should be taught and learned and tested and so forth. From the continuity, the presencing, instead of by dividing by some kind of false time called now, so that that was then, it's past, and this is coming, it's future, that in that continuity where the present nowness has been dissolved into presence, the tensegrity, the continuity of the scalar of actuality is now free to be quite real. Page 4 of our notes for the presentation, and each week I've been doing this since early 1970 in Canada. It's almost 45 years, making weekly handouts of notes and illustrations. Page 4 begins, learning tunnels beyond the polarized bounds of planned, programmed education information, and is an integral part of this presentation today, and is a differential resonance of it to a harmonic that brings the dimensions of space-time and the dimensions of the ecology of consciousness into a new, Buckminster Fuller called it a synergy, synergetics, the way in which the energized dynamics of a structure that has that tensegrity. Frank Lloyd Wright called it tenuity. And he called what the architecture then presents, not is, but presents, is the continuity which the experience initially is the space, the spatiality. And as one moves, conscious of the time in the movement of the time in the space of the amplitude, not only give a space-time to what the building, to what the city, to what the garden would be, but gives to it a tenuity that allows for consciousness of the visioning of all of this in a quintessential, opened way that the art of the architecture becomes apparent. One of the classic examples of this is the Marin County Civic Center in San Rafael, California. The building looks like a cartoon from 1950s science fiction comic books until you began to walk through it. And the pace of walking at about 2 miles an hour, the entire building, the entire complex of buildings, lifts off the false identification into the realm of architecture. This quality of identity and change is part of the classic realization of the work of a woman who is now, she'll be 73 this year, still teaching. Her name is Caroline Walker Bynum. One of her specialities was late medieval history and culture. She did a fantastic volume among many of hers called The Resurrection of the Body. Not about the medieval understanding of the resurrection of the spirit, but of the body. That there were questions that could not be dissolved, could not be swallowed. If the body is resurrected, which body of yours is resurrected? At what period of your life? In what condition? Is it still natural, subject to nature, etc., etc.? And that this quality of the quandaries of the resurrection of the body become, in the worrying way, an apocalyptic fear, which is susceptible to a node in the massive dynamic of the time forms of civilization. It becomes super attenuated at the middle, at the core of the time form. And because the carrier wave is the largest time form of about 2,000 years, its center is the millennium. And so the apocalyptic fears of all of the images and feelings possible, the evil threatening, the radioactivity, as it were, devastating, ending life. And that millennial apocalyptic quality as a crisis in civilization characterizes the rise of the character of joyous openness in the carrier wave and seeks to find a place that it can settle. When one goes from the carrier wave to its reference wave of about 350 years before, it is the reference wave that gives the indication of how the solution can be approached. But in our carrier wave, the reference wave goes back to 350 years, back to the 1650s, back to Newton and Leibniz, the discovery of calculus, Principia Mathematica, which is almost indecipherable to a population at large since the beginning. So that reference wave, that mathematical, the mathematization of language written and read, does not service the large population. And so by default, they slide back to the previous reference wave, which came 350 years before the millennium, back to the 650s AD. And at that reference wave, one finds real tigers prowling. They were not then tigers so much as royal lions of great achievement, but in the regression by how they are now experienced, they are demanding tigerishly of changing and challenging not only the circumstances of the carrier wave, but of the reference wave as well, and saying, look, we warned you in the millennia of 1000 AD. And our reference wave here in 650 points to that millennial apocalyptic situation, and it has all come to pass, hasn't it? It isn't new. It's an even worse parallel to the millennium. The whole generation styles itself as millennials by no accident. And its reference wave is what was powerful coming into civilization at the 650s. Dynastic China, Islam, many other developments around the planet, which are great advances, great at the time, fantastic, but in a doubling regression, it is not understood as a reference wave. in the sinusoidal energy of a whole aeon, of a 2,000-year period. That it is the emergence from a trough where everything was so mystical that it began to be incomprehensible. How could anyone understand this mysteriousness, this mysticalness? And that reference wave was the climbing out of that slough of despond, as John Bunyan put in Pilgrim's Progress. That dynastic China of the Tang dynasty, Tang Tai Tsung, was one of the great periods, maybe the greatest of Chinese history. The development of Muhammad and the Quran, the raising up of a desert exiled population for 2,600 years by that time, into greatness. Without an understanding of the kaleidoscopic dimension of history, there is no way to understand. It comes as puzzles, conundrums, quandaries, challenges. And one of Caroline Walker Bynum's most great books, famous books, is Jesus' Mother. Studies in the spirituality of the High Middle Ages that begins with the millennium. It begins about 1000 AD. It takes almost 100 years for it to gain real traction. And by the 1100s, it was flourishing in such a way that it was challenging to the imperiums that ruled. Not only the church and the kingdoms, but all of the visionings of bringing back and reclaiming, and the number one way in which those claims, those clamorings of power focused itself was on the Crusades. All of the fears now for those seeking succor in that previous reference wave, look upon what is happening in the eyes. You're doing a number which is apocalyptic, which is a new crusade against us. For exactly what we understand is the very energy of time for us, our dynamic. The quality of Caroline Walker Bynum comes to a high point in a book of hers that came out in 2011 called Metamorphosis and Identity. When you look at the website printout on her, it's not even mentioned. Published by Zone Books in New York, an esoteric sub-publisher. Metamorphosis and identity. Because the very insoluble polarity conjuncted by those is exactly and precisely, specifically, the bone of contention. Next week we'll go into how all of this comes to pass so that by 2015, coming up very, very fast now, is an aeonic year of challenge, requiring a tensegrity and a tenuity, a continuity and a continuous humanity to resolve, not dissolve, but resolve. Beyond meaning, there is the meaning of meaning, and that we'll find. It's discoverable, it's recognizable. More next week.